the family business, that's where I realized that the entire business is almost near to bankrupt. And that led me to the journey of investigating in terms of what happened to our business, what went wrong. And the first realization which came up to my mind, and the research which I analyzed, was that we use our short-term funds into long-term assets, long-term businesses, and that's where the entire business got collapsed. So eventually, immediately after that, I started to work into various products, and I also, being we had a membership, stock exchange membership card, so started to learn into stock markets, started to read a lot of prospectus, which what is today called DRHP. It used to be called a prospectus in those days, and that is where my fascination for numbers, my fascination for analyzing working capital started. And I did my doctorate into working capital management of tobacco companies in India. So basically, if we see the cigarette companies in India, which are four, main ITC, GTC, VS3, and Corporate Phillips, all of them are highly profitable companies. They are into extensive working capital management, right? So, and they are pretty cash-rich companies as well. So that gave me an insight that almost all businesses make a single mistake, which is how to use their working capital. And when we use the word working capital, it is not only for businesses, it is for everyone. It could be for a micro organization, SME, large corporates, anyone. Even I would say as an individual, हम लोग के पास सबके पास में जो working capital जिसे हम कह सकते हैं कि हमारी जो cash flow आ रही है जा रही है, whatever it is, right? So if we don't use it rightly and we cannot manage the long-term, short-term aspect, we also can get into a trouble. So I'll just share those insights with you. And of course, in 2009, I took over a company in South Africa, and that's again, we turned around the company only by managing the working capital. So a lot of the innovative products, so factoring the product which we do is something which is not still very popular in India, but this is the only product for a MSME, especially for the masses now, wherein the banks do not or would not prefer to give working capital CC limits to smaller businesses to, in terms of 20, 25, 30, 40, 50 lakh rupees without a collateral security. So I'll just take you through the journey. Can I share my slide?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So if you have any questions, just drop in the question at the chat box, or maybe we'll take the question at the end of the session. So the topic today is make a working capital work for you. So, we have a saying that the money works for you, and let the money work for you, especially in the stock market or various asset classes. Here, for any business, the most important part is the working capital. So everybody, if somebody can plan it in a manner that working capital works for them, automatically all the parameters of a business are gets to the next level. The first and the foremost learning in working capital is don't use short-term funds for long-term use. I think this is the core philosophy, formula, and sacrosanct mantra. If we could say, if I were to allow this, it's like a most sacred mantra for any business. Even for people like into stock markets, if you have a money which is lying with you for a short-term money, we should not be investing into long-term shares looking for a long-term scenario, because we do not know what can happen in the market tomorrow. So short-term funds and the long-term funds is a very, very important thing. And there are n number of examples where businesses like, I would say, Kingfisher, many other businesses went bust because they use the short-term funds into very, very long-term capital and asset-intensive businesses. Secondly, हम लोगों के business में क्या होता है, especially when you talk about the MSMEs, we look at very short-term perspective. हमको रोज struggle करना पड़ता है, हम लोग को रोज it's like रोज कुआं खोदते हैं, रोज पानी निकालते हैं. So in that case, we try and do a solution which is short-term. हम जुगाड़ जो है, the most innovative Indian product जुगाड़, we use जुगाड़ everywhere, right, from production to even financial instrument, also from financial management also. So any jugaad, it could be good for the machinery production and everything, but it is not good for financial needs. हम लोग को short term जुगाड़ से finance को manage नहीं करना चाहिए. So it's a very important point to understand And that is where the short term and long term comes into businesses. So what makes businesses fail? The single point is mismanagement of short term funds. Short term funds means both surplus or deficit. So these are both the sides. So uh, when I did my PhD in research, there were one of the companies called GTC Industries. Now, all these four companies were making money left, right, center. So if you see company like ITC Industries or VST, they are always cash rich. They have always a surplus of money. In fact, उनको कई बार पहले मालूम नहीं होता कि what we should do with this money. But there's a corporate governance, and good managed companies use their working capital or the surplus in a rightful manner. उन्होंने ऐसा नहीं है कि कैश फ्लो बढ़ गया है तो उसको हाथों हाथ ही हम लोग लॉन्ग टर्म एसेट्स में डाला दें या वी क्रिएट समथिंग which is not liquid, you know. So all larger corporates have their treasuries to manage. So even if we have a surplus, we should be deploying it on a very short-term basis. In fact, the money market, liquid mutual funds. Sometimes as an MSME, हमको लगता है कि why should we waste the money putting into a FD or a liquid part? But till the time we do not know the long-term use of this money or a short-term use of this money, it's better to park that money rather than misuse that money for a long-term thing. So first point is key when we start analyzing, working capital is something which cannot be standardized. Every business has its unique requirements. Because they say stock market, maybe a broker has a different requirement, right? A manufacturing company has a different requirement. A service industry is a different requirement. Among the service industry, if you say an IT-enabled services, which is into hardware, has a different working capital requirement. Somebody who's providing OPEX-based services, operating services, has a very different kind of requirement. So every business has a different working capital requirement, and it cannot be standardized. Now, why it can't be standardized? Because the working capital is not visible in the balance sheet. Balance sheet, we can see assets, we can see liabilities. Sorry, we have to arrive to calculate a working capital. How do we calculate? We'll see during the course of this presentation as well. But since it cannot be standardized, every business model has a different cycle, and that's the reason it is a very generic product. It can't be standardized. Working capital is a hidden asset, and it is an art to manage it. जैसे अपनी बात हुई कि working capital is a lifeline of a business. Working capital is a blood for business, right? So जैसे हम लोगों की बॉडी के अंदर ब्लड चलता रहता है, हमको दिखता नहीं है कभी भी, but the first thing when you go to a doctor says to do a blood test, whether it is to check a sugar or cholesterol, whatever it is. Similarly, the working capital is inside the business, and it is always an art to manage it. What simple art है? We'll tell you some tools and tricks. So firstly, some idea about how the ratio of various businesses into working capital, right? So also what I've seen is businesses which we have high working capital and low fixed assets get a good valuation. If you see this entire slide, like hotels, hospital, restaurant, they have a high fixed assets ratio, a very small working capital ratio. On the contrary, if you go down this slide and if you see at the end, we have got service industry or FMCG goods, the FMCG, we all understand that they gives a better return in terms of PE equivalent because they have a higher working capital and lower fixed assets ratio. But firstly, how do we, if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. To manage it rightly, we need to measure it. So although, as we said, it can't be seen, but there are tools and tricks to manage it. So we have to make sure that we first measure it, then only we can manage it. Now, how do we measure it? What is working capital? There are two ways of calculating working capital. One is total current assets, is called the gross working capital. So हम लोग बोलचाल की भाषा में बोलते हैं कि हमको working capital चाहिए, या I am short of working capital. In that sense, you are talking about the funds, the money part, but that is not even working capital. Sometimes even when you take a credit from your supplier, that's also working capital. So exactly, if we talk about net working capital required for a business, is current assets minus current liabilities. This is the net working capital required for one business. Most of the time, हम जब बोलते हैं कि working capital short है, तो हम इसको differentiate नहीं करते. We don't go and do a real calculation in terms of current assets and current liabilities. We are just thinking about the funds कि बैंक में पैसा है या नहीं है. Now, when we talk about current assets to calculate working capital, there are certain things which we include. And on a personal level, with my experience, I recommend people not to take certain items. So I'll just cover it quickly. Inventories, account receivables, debtors, which are less than 90 days, cash bank balance, short-term investments, prepaid expenses. But we should exclude loans and advances and debtors which are beyond 90 days. Because if a debtor is beyond 90 days, it is very, very highly unpredictable in terms of the collection cycle. वो पैसा कब आएगा? And we'll see sometimes people give a long credit, virtually becomes a term loan to the customer. I have seen people जो 180 days में 270 days में pay करते हैं, which is as good as work term loan. So to do a right and very pragmatic approach to calculate work current assets, we should exclude those long debtors. Similarly, when we are calculating the current liabilities, we should use the creditors, expenses, outstanding bills, bills payable, but we should also add something like the EMIs and the interest payment for the loans, bank overdraft limits, CC limit, which are again a short-term thing, short-term loans, as per accounting norms, all 1 year repayment of loans. So anything which is short-term as a liability, we should add as a current liability. So that will give us a very, very clear and a concise and practical approach and the calculation for the working capital. So that will become a net working capital for us. So now the next question is, working capital is the lifeline of any business. So how often should we analyze it? I mean, should we do it on a daily basis? Should we do it on a monthly basis? But typically speaking, it all depends upon how you work. Also depends on the working capital cycle of your business, right? So if the working capital cycle is very fast or the collection cycle is pretty fast, then it should be done on a day-to-day or dynamic basis. But for example, if the cycle is 15 days or 1 month, then of course you can calculate that on a monthly basis as well. So more you work, more working capital you need. Unlike fixed assets, those are required when you increase the capacity, when you have a higher growth. Here, if you're talking about working capital, if you are wanting to do more businesses, on the contrary, also likewise, if you are entering a slower phase of the economy, or where the collections are going slow, or let's say in times of COVID, when the sales were low, but there were debts to be paid, the working capital requirement increased. Because if you see the current assets working, we exclude debtors which are beyond 90 days. So the more you work, the more working capital is required. Now, there are certain expenses which will silently eat into our working capital and which we will not even come to know. Just like अपने blood के अंदर there are certain parameters जो हमारे blood को spoil करता रहता है and eventually gives the body is damaged, right? So there are certain things which we have to keep a tab on to make sure the quality of working capital is always good. These are all types of fixed costs: EMIs, rents, interest, salaries, leases, etc. So, in fact, I will see in a couple of more slides that whenever we want to manage the working capital or efficiently, we should move from a fixed cost to a transaction-based cost. Sometimes हमको transaction-based cost लगती है जरूर high है as a percentage or the absolute number, but long term it's a cheaper way of managing a working capital. So working hard and working smart are two different things. How to smartly deal with your working capital to make it work for. This is the core understanding, and I'll tell you tools and tricks in terms of there are small experiences which have collated from not only from Indian operations but learned across the world, that these are tools and tricks where you can manage these working capital efficiently. The first smart way of managing working capital is don't become your customer's financiers. Ideally 45 days a credit period which is ideal. अगर आपने 90 days से ऊपर की credit दे दी आपके customer को, that is as good as a term loan. Believe me. See, why does a customer need a credit? He may need a credit because of his cycle. If it's into manufacturing, raw material आएगा, manufacture करेगा, बेचेगा, right? That is one need. Otherwise, if he's using your credit as a working capital for him, then basically you become his financer. So we should not, ideal is 30 days, 45 days, even 60 days is okay. But beyond 90 days, we should not give a credit to the customer. Second thing is think like a corporate. corporates, if you see, MSMEs have a tendency कि we should buy our own assets. हम property खरीद लेते हैं, हम asset खरीद लेते हैं, सस्ता पड़ता है, But the बड़ी companies जो corporates होती हैं, generally they would outsource things. They will reduce their fixed cost. They will to take things on lease, right from a car to an office to a building to manpower also, they'll outsource that. So those are parameters which we should also think now, and especially in the Indian context now, where the service industry has gone beyond a level. Today, I've seen people who they don't want to own a car. Why should I pay an EMI every month when I have an Ola Uber to just a call away? Right. So those are things which we can incorporate as a MSME now, especially with technology in place. Another point is fixed cost to transaction-based cost. So this is I just share with you that I'll give an example. Now with the we have got co-working spaces. So for example, I need a incremental 5 people to sit, or the new manpower 5 people. So earlier हम लोग क्या करेंगे, या तो पूरा office lease पे लेंगे, उसको furnish करेंगे या खरीदेंगे. Now there are options available like co-working spaces. You take 5 seats for a month or 5 months, or whenever you think it's stabilized, then you can take up on a regular lease basis. So these are examples where we can use the transaction-based, working capital can be saved over here. Excess liquidity is risky. This is a very important point. अपने कहावत है, necessity is the mother of all inventions, right? So similarly, when we are into crisis or we are shortage of funds, that is where we have become innovative. We start collecting money, right? So we make more pressure on our customers to pay us early. The movement is the other way around. It's everywhere there's liquidity. ज़्यादा पानी हो गया, ज़्यादा कुछ भी हो गया, हर जगह हम लोग, that's human nature, we become lethargic, we become complacent, and then of course, it becomes very risky for the money because we might use it into uncharted or unrequired areas as well. This is something which I have tried a number of times. Power of 1% piggy bank. हम लोग 1% like a loose change, हम शाम को आते हैं घर पे, बच्चे बोलते हैं चिल्लर दे दो box के अंदर, and then when you see after a couple of years when you break that box, you find a decent amount of money, right? So today, for example, MSME, even if whatever the margin of the business is, if somebody has a higher obligation of a fixed cost every month, let's say EMIs or loans to be repaid, अगर वो हर collection का 1% को sideline कर दे, he can easily, very comfortably manage all his fixed obligations very, very easily. And that is also, it becomes a corpus for them, which helps you for a long-term scenario to invest into asset building or invest into many other parameters. This was 1% moves out from a working capital and goes into a savings box. No to unrelated diversification, yes to focus. Sometimes we tend to diversify into unrelated products. I am doing, let's say, in fact, it's very popular in our industry. We are an NBFC purely focused onto working capital finance. So we don't do consumer loans, we don't do home loans, we don't do asset backed up loans, right? So we only do working capital. Now, the moment it happens in every business. I mean, somebody is doing a trading of, let's say, a stationery. Tomorrow he might want to do a trading of something else, which is, let's say, food, perishable commodities. So until unless that's totally unrelated, there might be extension to something what we know. Maybe stationery person can add something like a packaging product, but going to very unrelated is something which eats into your working capital. Because you are using the short-term money for a long-term scenario, which we are uncertainties. Another is, don't make heavy investment into fixed assets. Use working capital without using working capital without infusion of equity. So long-term में क्या होता है कि हमने कोई asset खरीदना है, हमने whether it's a factory or whatever it is, हमने asset खरीदने के लिए हमारी working capital में से ही पैसा invest कर दिया. And we think we'll borrow from the bank later on. Right now, let's start doing it. Or sometimes even if you pay a margin money to get an asset financing, right? So without calculating our working capital, without calculating our fund-based needs for a couple of months, we just divert the money from our short-term kitty to a long-term thing. So this also long-term affects our working capital. Next point is diversion of funds. We have seen this and that's where the corporate governance, which the Indian laws provide, especially the Companies Act. So the way the governance is there in the company, it is very very good. Sometimes MSME feels कि यार ये तो बहुत restrictive है, बहुत it's difficult to take the money out of the company, but it is very very good for us for the business, because otherwise क्या होता है कि घर में शादी हुई, कोई need हुई, मकान बना, we divert the funds from the business because we are the owner also and we are the manager also. So that's another way where the working capital gets diverted. Avoid the lure of targets and discounts. Sometimes the suppliers give us targets, discounts, extra targets, and we think कि हमको इसको अभी लेने से हमारा पैसा बचेगा, we'll save more, but without analyzing the effect of that particular transaction on working capital. So maybe these businesses like the commodities, they are like agro-based industries or metal-based industries, where people would sometimes keen to take a stock. They want to stock, keeping in mind कि यार कल ही भाव बढ़ने वाले हैं. That's not a good idea for working capital. Even if you have a surplus, this will eat away on our working capital. एक कहानी है उधारी राम नगदी राम की, and it's a very important learning which we all have realized that उधारी राम नगदी राम दो ब्रदर्स होते थे, उनकी नेक्स्ट डोर पे दुकान होती थी. उधारी राम हमेशा उधार में खरीदता था, नगदी राम हमेशा नगद में खरीदता था. उधारी राम 30 दिन की उधार पे लेता था, नगदी राम always used to pay on cash. I would feel proud about it. कोविड हुआ, मद्दी आई, whatever it is, and नगदी राम ने बोला कि भाई उधारी राम ने बोला कि अब मैं 30 दिन की जगह 60 दिन पे क्रेडिट पे पैसा दूंगा, या 45 दिन पे दूंगा, 45 days पे दूंगा. So all the suppliers say okay fine, हम डील कर रहे हैं उधारी राम से 15-20 years से, happy, that doesn't matter, ये कहीं जाने वाला नहीं है. But नगदी राम जो था, basically he was paying always cash. And so the moment he asked his suppliers, he give me 30 days credit, and everybody said इसकी कुछ problem लगती है financially, जो cash देने वाला बंदा उधार क्यों ले रहा है, and nobody gave him a credit, right? So credit is always important in cash, and also if you take on credit, your net working capital increases. So it's a very nice thing to buy on credit and sell on cash. Debt is a very very strong asset. It is not a liability. Again, debt is an asset, it's not a liability, but it should be used judiciously. Debt free should not be our aim, because हम debt free होके we can't do business. Business के लिए growth चाहिए, growth के लिए आपको leveraging करनी ही पड़ेगी. You have to use all the assets available to grow the business, and debt is also an asset. But for that, we have to be very careful. How do we use that asset? Corporate governance, I have spoken earlier. Ring fencing your business, financial discipline are very, very essential for all sides of business. This is a very important point. A lot of time MSMEs कहते हैं हम बहुत छोटे हैं, हम कहाँ corporate governance लगाएंगे, हम क्या ring fence करेंगे. So corporate governance, ring fencing are words, but anybody can do it. It's a matter of discipline, right? I mean today it doesn't matter कि कोई 1000 crore की company ही सब काम कर सकती है, किसी का 1 crore का turnover भी हो, वो भी काम कर सकता है, as long as he is into discipline की I will not draw this money out, I will have a different bank account for my personal expenditures, I will not put my personal expenses to the company accounts, stuff like that. It's a very small thing, but that's a financial discipline which also goes down rightly to your employees and all the stakeholders. This is my learning. We should have financial coaches and mentors and not advisors, because coach और mentor होता है उनका पूरा sweat, blood, everything, तन मन धन आपके पीछे लगाता है for your success. Advisors advise you initial part, and then they may be with you or may not be with you in your journey. But coaches and mentors are with you for your entire journey. Tech is the cheapest commodity available this day. Use it. So in today's world, we have got like not only Tally as a software, but Zoho is there. We have got Intuit, QuickBooks, and number of software are there. So today, even lots of mobile applications are there. So technology is the only product which is going down. Rest all is going up. So we should be able to use technology into our businesses on the right manner, and because that's again a tool which will help us manage the working capital very efficiently. Excel is for data analysis, not for capturing data. ये मैंने से देखा बहुत से businesses होते हैं, even they would like to keep their cash books on Excel. वो सोचते हैं कि Excel पे हम लोग करना easy है, calculation करना easy होता है, but that's a wrong thing to manage. Once you have a data coming out of a software, whether it's a ERP, Tally or anywhere, or if you want to make a decision based on the data, then Excel is for analysis, not for capturing or recording data. Please do not do it. It gives a very loose control over the data. So after these small tools and tricks for the smart working capital, most important is turnover is vanity, profit is vanity, and cash is reality. Cash is the king. हम लोग हमेशा इवन इफ यू सी दी न्यूज़पेपर, वो हमेशा बात करते हैं उसका इतना टॉप लाइन हो गया, टर्नओवर इतना हो गया, राइट? देन इन स्टार्टअप्स की दुनिया के अंदर आज भी हो रहा है कि दे आर नॉट मेकिंग प्रॉफिट, but still they have the cash. As long as any startup is having a cash for burning for 1 year, 2 year, they can sustain. That's the way they are growing. So even though they are burning money, they may not be having a bigger turnovers, but they are having a cash which is coming up to them from investors. I don't endorse that. That's a different story. But the point here is the most important point is cash. Instead of working on a profit basis, we should work on a cash profit basis, right? So this is very, we may have business which is having a very low turnover. Turnover is not fancy ki we should have a 200 crore turnover and do a 1% profit margin, right? Instead of that, maybe 50 crore turnover with a 10% margin or 4% margin is any day better than that product. So as we mentioned, now we know how to manage working capital. There are a lot of some few ratios. These are all available into public domain as well. But these are test parameters like the blood markers. When the doctor says you get a blood test done, and he'll see how the stronger business is. Similarly, these are working capital test parameters, which every business should use it. Very, very simple to use. Current ratio, quick ratio. These are very simple ratio which any of the accountant can do it, as long as you can ask him to do it once a month or 15 days a month, depending on your working capital cycle. Now, conventionally, we have seen कि working capital financing कैसे मिलता है. हम banks में आते हैं, cash credit limit, CC limit मिलती है बैंक से. Family friends से हम unsecured loans, borrowings करते हैं, right? But in the new modern world, the technology and so many things available, there are alternate sources of working capital also available, right? So in the alternate sources, the first thing is from ad hoc based financing, we should move to a transaction based financing. So whether it's invoice discounting, supply chain finance, vendor finance, dynamic discounting, factoring, so all these are transaction based financing, which are working capital financing. These are alternate ways of working capital finance. So others are suppliers credit. You can sell on cash, even if you give us a cash discount. That's a cheaper and faster way of collecting a working capital, right? Just-in-time inventory. If you reduce the inventory and with the logistics being streamlined in the country, technology helping the logistics in the country, we can reduce our inventory levels, which will also help us generate more working capital for the business. So I've spoken about channel finance, buy now, factoring, invoice discounting. So what is factoring? I'll just share because this is a new product for the industry, especially in the country. So factoring, basically, if you can understand, that is a credit card for B2B businesses, right? So the seller sells on credit to the buyer, and the seller bears a discounting cost for an X number of days. Just like in a B2C, when we go and do a shopping on a credit card, the merchant bears the cost of the discount, right? And as a buyer, we get a free interest-free credit period for a few days from the credit card company, right? Similarly, factoring ke andar, most of the time, the buyer gets a free credit period. Buyer also gets some discount, additional discount, grace period, etc. Now there's the digital factoring available in the country, which is mobile app driven, and which also enables you with the GST in place to do business across the country without anybody say, let's say somebody in Bhubaneswar can sell to somebody in Bareilly, जो कि पहले लगता था कि हम कैसे उसको बेचेंगे, ऐसा डूब तो नहीं जाएगा, whether he'll pay on time or not. So factoring with the also assists every business. And the most important factoring is the right product for the MSMEs when they are selling to other MSMEs. So why factoring? The first part is the risk of bad debts are covered. So an example there, Bhubaneswar to Bareilly, And that's a very, because in factoring, you are selling the receivable to the factoring company. So once the receivable is sold to the factoring company, the risk is passed from you to the factoring company. Also, the buyers get disciplined when they realize that, and they also get an advantage. So when you have a disciplined buyers, you have more liquidity to trade more, and with factoring, you don't have to do a receivables management. In fact, I've seen in many other countries, वहाँ पे तो people don't have that collection system in that organization. MSMEs don't keep collection team, right? They would just outsource the entire thing to a factoring company who will manage the entire collection for the factoring company. Similarly, another point is factoring is very important because there is no ad hoc cost. It's only transaction-based cost. Unlike a working capital limit or a term loan, where you pay the money for the entire year, here you pay the money for the n number of days, 10 दिन, 5 दिन, 18, 20, whatever number of days you're using the money. So you pay for what you are using. So in God we trust, rest all his data. So if we have to be very effective in working capital, do it right thing, we need to make sure that we have a reliable data. Just like any doctor, any blood test is important. Data is very important for the effective data means numbers in terms of business, working capital management. So to do that, we require technology, which should be a partner in growth. Now with computers, tally, mobile, internet, cloud, ERP, Zoom, all these help us manage the data and have a view on the working capital transactions. Before I end this presentation, I like to leave the most important core point again: how to make your working capital work for you. Just one trick: don't use short-term funds for long-term use. Every time you are spending a money, whether it's a personal need, business need, please just ponder upon, think it over for a moment, or maybe you have a process if you are a big organization, that is this money being used for a long-term thing or a short-term thing. Financial markets may, especially into the lending business, it's called ALM, asset liability management. So I think every business should have this ALM concept. If you are able to do that rightly, then there will never be a problem for working capital management, and none of the businesses can go bust. Most of the time, because if you are using a short term to, why would somebody use a short term to a long term, right? So I'll give an example. As an entrepreneur tomorrow, I think I should diversify, let's say, into making chocolates. And to make chocolate, I require a new machinery and a new equipment. I don't know how to make chocolates, right? So, and why I'm going to chocolate is, for example, मेरा जो regular business है, it's making decent and very good profits, and I do not know what to do with that short-term money, right? So I use that short-term money, start a new business which is totally unrelated, undiverse, unfocused for me, and I use this short-term money to a long-term scenario, because हमको लगता है कि जो मेरी business का अभी business cyclic है, I don't need this fund for 6 months. So those are the cascading effects which can get down. So please do not use your short-term funds to long-term fund. I think I'll end my presentation here. Thank you so much, guys, for hearing me out. If you have your questions, I'm open to the questions.
I would request all the participants to write their questions in the chat box.
So first question is, for financing a new related diversification, should I use my surplus funds or should I use debt? So Sachin ji, पहले और सबसे पहले आपको ये एनालाइज करनी चाहिए कि आपकी at that point of time, how much is your working capital right at that point of time? Number one. Number two, let's say for a period of next say 1 year or whatever that diversification का cash flow आएगा, तब तक आपका जो existing business है, उसकी working capital कितनी है, कितनी need रहेगी आपकी. If you have a surplus beyond that, that point of time you can use that surplus, but that requires a very strict discipline to make sure कि आपने अगर let's say for example आपका surplus 100,000 है, 1 लाख surplus आपका, right? और आपकी need वहाँ पे let's say 90,000 है, तो आपको discipline चाहिएगा कि मैं 10,000 को वहाँ पे use कर सकूँ. And अगर if I use a debt, which is a better thing to do in a sense, but that will also have a cascading effect that will get into a fixed EMI or fixed cost every month. So you have to balance your cash flow and the obligation. So your again assets and the liabilities. I hope it's answered, Sachin ji. Sure, Meji, I'll just try and share that slide with you. Although it's a pretty generic thing. I mean, definitely it can change from industry to industry. So just give me a second. Here. So मैं आपको एक simple formula देता हूँ अमित जी. It's a very simple formula. All capital intensive industries, which are, in fact, I remember many years ago, somebody who taught me into stock market, he said never invest 3H, hotel, hospital, and housing, because these are very, very high fixed asset intensive industries and very low working capital. Those are very high risk. You've seen a company like Hotel Leela going almost bankrupt, right? So putting up all your eggs into one basket, which is your fixed assets. And if I put the other way around, if you're working capital intensive business, उसमें क्या होता है, आपका exit plan भी बड़ा easy हो जाता है. So always recommended to mix it that way. So I think that's the basic formula. People say debt is always cheaper than equity. Yes, exactly, debt is always cheaper than equity. But यहाँ पे क्या है कि सचिन जी, इसमें डेट तो आप रेस कर लेंगे, लेकिन डेट का ऑब्लिगेशन क्या है वो इम्पोर्टेंट है. Because if it's a debt which you are having a fixed cost every month, fixed outflow, cash outflow, then it is different. So there are 2 points. Cost is, of course, that is cheaper, but cash flow के अंदर आपका fixed obligation will eat into working capital. So you'll have to manage. कहीं ऐसा नहीं हो कि आपने जो डेट लिया उसका आपका सी अल्टीली नॉर्मली हम लोग क्या करते हैं, जब कॉस्ट लगाते हैं डेट को लेके, हमने कहा मैंने 10 लाख का लोन ले लिया एक साल के लिए, तो मेरा 6-7-8% से 70,000 रुपीज लग रहा है साल का, राइट. आई एम जस्ट गिविंग एग्जांपल. On the contrary, when you are talking about an EMI repayment for that 10 lakh rupee loan in 12 months, you are talking about almost close to a lakh of rupees a month. So on the contrary, अगर आप 7% interest लेते हैं, 70,000 rupees per year आता है आपका 10 lakh के लोन पे approximately. But when you are talking about an obligation on a cash flow basis, you have to pay 1 lakh rupees almost every month. So that's where balance of short term and long term has to manage, the cash flow has to manage. Yeah, Amit ji, outsourcing, leasing is always better. We might think initially that we might think कि हमको ये transactionally महंगा पड़ रहा है, but eventually it will be we'll save two things. A, we'll save our working capital, number one. Number two, we'll also save our precious capital also. For example, आपने अगर let's say अपने को 10 computers ले लीजिए एक पल के लिए, right? मेरे पास एक लिमिटेड कैपिटल है, मैंने 10 computers खरीद लिए. 3 ऑप्शन हो सकते हैं. मैंने अपनी कैपिटल से खरीद लिए तो मेरी कैपिटल विच एक्सपेंसिव ब्लॉक होगी. नंबर 2, मैंने 10 कंप्यूटर्स को लोन पे ले लिया, सो आई हैव अ obligation every month. And the third thing is, because if we MSMEs are normally a growing industry, they are growing. They do not know, most of the MSMEs might go 50, 60, 70% year on year. So उनको आज 3 पीसी की जरूरत है, हो सकता है कल 6 की जरूरत पड़ जाए नेक्स्ट ईयर, राइट. या आज 1,000 स्क्वायर फीट की जरूरत है, कल 2,000 की जरूरत पड़ सकती है. So instead of putting your precious capital or debt onto that, it's better to outsource or lease those products. And I've seen even most of the startups, I mean, most of the corporates, I mean, they do it that way. Banks don't own any asset. They would always lease a property. Yes, Sachin ji, this is a very nice question जो कि आज की तारीख में corporates काफी करते हैं. Sometimes they play an arbitrage on their treasury. So let's say अभी तो liquid funds are giving a better return. Earlier when the liquid funds were giving, let's say 3% returns or 4% returns, debt funds जो short term play, they would say 3% per annum. On the contrary, they would say to tell their creditor, supplier कि आप मुझे 2% CD दे दीजिए. That will make it easier, right? But again, that's a good way to do it. But balancing your cash flow is important. ऐसा नहीं है कि हम इंसेंटिव और डिस्काउंट के लिए हम कैश ज़्यादा यूज कर लें, जबकि हमारे इनकमिंग फंड्स को हमने कंट्रोल नहीं कर पाए, because that's also connected. This will only happen when you have excess liquidity, right? So आपका excess liquidity होगी तभी आप काम कर पाओगे, बट हम excess liquidity को मैनेज करना बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है. हमने इधर तो ल्यूर ले लिया कि यार 2% सीडी एक्स्ट्रा मिल रही है, हम ले लें, लेकिन हमारे आगे के कैश फ्लो सही नहीं आए, तो दिस विल हैव अ काउंटर इम्पैक्ट टू अस. In fact, to add on to it, there's always a cost of doing a business. Rather, there's always a cost of doing anything. So we ignore that cost. So even if you see this kind of a structure, it's not that कि simple हमने 2% CD वहाँ पे ले ली और मुझे 3% debt fund में मिल रहा था. There's always a cost involved. So we should also, calculate and incorporate those costs into our structures. Right, guys. I think we'll close it out here. Will that be okay?
Yeah, I
Any
guess
other
there are no more questions.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for hearing me out, and thanks PhillipCapital for giving me the time to come. Give me this presentation. Thank you.
So it was a very comprehensive and exhaustive discussion covering all the aspects of the subjects, and I'm sure that all the participants will be taking along with them immense amount of knowledge, wisdom, and experience. Thank you once again for such an insightful session.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye bye. Thanks.
For any further queries, you may contact us. Our coordinators are mentioned on the screen.
Investment in securities market are subject to market risks. Read all the related documents carefully before investing.